Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give in the cause now in hearing shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
You may be seated.
Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
There's been a motion to sequester witnesses in the case. All that means is until all the evidence is over, you can only be in the courtroom when you're testifying. You can't talk about your testimony with the other witnesses or let them talk about theirs with you. Thank you. Please.
Good morning, Dr. Hebben. Can you please state your first and last names?
My name is Nancy Hebben.
Can you spell your last name, ma'am?
H-E-B-B, like in boy, E-N.
Dr. Hebben, can you tell us, please, what your current employment is?
I am employed in my own private practice at this point in time.
And Dr. Hebben, can you describe for us your educational background?
I got my PhD in 1979 from Wayne State University in Detroit. I did my internship here in the Boston area at the Boston VA. From there I went to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where I did a National Research Service Award for 3 years as a postdoctoral fellowship and specialized further within the area of neuropsychology. Following that, I went to the McLean Hospital, where I was chief consulting neuropsychologist from 1982 to 1998, after which I went into private practice.
And what are your current certifications or licensure that you hold anywhere?
Well, I've been licensed as a psychologist and health service provider in the Commonwealth since 1980. I was also licensed, but I've put that on in an active status in Oklahoma as a psychologist. I'm also board certified in clinical neuropsychology from the American Board of Professional Psychology. I think that's been for 21 years or something like that at this point.
And Dr. Hebben, do you are you on any editorial boards?
I do ad hoc reviews for journals like the Journal of Clinical Neuropsychology or related journals in my field.
And are you a member of any professional practice activities?
You mean like membership organizations?
Yes, sorry.
Yes. So I'm a member of the American Psychological Association and Division 40 of that organization, which is specifically for neuropsychology. I'm a member of the National Academy of Neuropsychology. I am a member of the International Neuropsychological Society. I'm also a member of the American Academy of Clinical Neuropsychology. I'm on the board of directors of that academy.
And do you have any teaching responsibilities?
I do.
What have those been?
Since I think it's 1985, I have taught in the extension school at Harvard University. I also have teaching responsibilities as part of my appointment at Harvard Medical School. They've changed the title recently, so let's see if I can get this right. An assistant professor of psychology in the Department of Psychiatry part-time at Harvard Medical School.
And Doctor, you talked a little bit about the work you did at McLean Hospital for 15 years, is that correct?
16, I believe.
Okay.
I'm still an associate at McLean Hospital. I just do not practice there full-time.
And what type of facility is McLean Hospital?
It's a private psychiatric hospital in the partner system. It's affiliated with Harvard Medical School, MGH.
Where is McLean located?
It's in Belmont, Massachusetts.
And what were your duties when you were I think you said, director of neuropsychology at McLean?
I was chief consulting neuropsychologist, which meant that I ran the neuropsychology department. I did assessments of children, adolescents, and adults in neuropsychology. I supervised postdocs and interns who are also learning in the field. I did the administrative work, I assigned cases, I did feedback sessions, consulted with the psychiatrists and other professionals on staff at McLean.
What is the, this may not be the most artful question, but what is the level of care provided at McLean? How ill are some of the patients?
Well, at the time that I was there, things have changed. Back in those days, it was common for people to come in, generally for pretty severe problems, which they couldn't handle on their own. And while I was there, it changed such that because we were no longer, we being the entire country, were no longer housing people in psychiatric facilities. It became such that people were generally even more severely, acutely ill and would have to come into hospital to control their illness.
Some of the patients that you evaluated and treated at McLean Hospital, were they experiencing acute psychosis?
Absolutely.
Okay. And you've talked, can you just explain to us what the field of neuropsychology is?
Neuropsychology, generally a neuropsychologist is clinical psychologist, which is what I am. My degree is in clinical neuropsychology. I've specialized in neuropsychology beginning in graduate school. But what we do is use psychological and neuropsychological measures to try to objectify brain illness, psychiatric illness. We also look at just sort of cognitive strengths and weaknesses. We attempt to understand someone's cognitive profile in order to be able to assess if their behavior is indicative of some sort of cognitive illness or psychiatric illness.
And in fact, the types of instruments or tests that you use, do they fall roughly into two categories in terms of what they test? Meaning cognition and behavior.
I would say that we're looking, we have tests that help us measure cognition, help us measure personality, help us measure emotion. And when we're putting together a battery of tests, we're going to try to address all of those issues as they are relevant.
Is there any distinction in those three areas of testing as to whether you would expect results to change in a patient depending on the point in time at which the test is being given?
Well, we might expect change if someone has suffered some sort of neurologic accident, a stroke, for example, or they've had a brain injury. You might expect change if someone was floridly psychotic, although you wouldn't test someone who was floridly psychotic at the time. Sometimes we're just looking to see developmental patterns that, there hasn't been any change at all. This is just the way the person's brain developed, and we're measuring their behavior to try to get back at figuring out what is it about their brain.
Dr. Hebben, in this particular test, were you retained at the request of Dr. Robert Kinshirf to conduct a neuropsychological evaluation of Philip Chism?
Yes, it's neuropsychological and psychological evaluation.
Okay. And whose decision was it to decide what instruments or what tests to use?
It was ultimately my decision based on my consultation with Dr. Kinshirf in trying to figure out what is it he was looking for. And so I could, based on what he was looking for in terms of did he want me to help him with diagnosis? Did he want me to help him with determining if Mr. Chism had some sort of cognitive defect? Did he want me to help him assess whether or not Mr. Chism was malingering or feigning mental illness? So he told me what he was looking for. I put together a battery of tests that would allow me to answer the questions.
Had you ever worked with Dr. Kinshirf before this particular case?
I had not.
And were there any sources that you reviewed in assisting you in determining what testing to do?
Yes, well, my education, training, and background, my 30-year plus history as a neuropsychologist and psychologist, but I also consulted in particular texts on looking at feigning of mental illness in children and adolescents.
Was there any challenge posed to you in designing a battery of tests given Mr. Chism's age at the time you were testing him of 16?
For some instruments, yes, there was.
And why is that?
Well, because most of the, neuropsychologists and psychologists use tests that are called performance validity tests and symptom validity tests to help us to understand if we can trust the information that we're obtaining from an individual. It's very easy to feign cognitive disability, to feign mental illness. It's an easy thing to do, and one cannot know that that's happening simply by looking at someone. We can't observe that. If someone's not putting their full effort into testing, we don't know that. If someone just simply says to us after we give them a memory test, oh, I can't remember that, we can't know that they really can't remember that. So we have tests that we use that we call performance validity tests and symptom validity tests that help us establish whether or not the data that we're obtaining is reliable and valid. So a performance validity test is specific for cognitive deficits. So these are tests that look like real neuropsychological tests, but indeed are very, very simple and easy to do. And they've been validated against populations of people with documented severe brain disease. And we've established that those individuals can pass these tests. So when we give a test like that to someone else and they fail that test, that helps us to know whether or not we can trust the data that we've obtained as being an accurate representation of their true cognitive ability at that time. Symptom validity tests help us understand whether or not we can trust that the person is accurately reporting their symptoms. You know, whether they're having hallucinations, whether they are depressed, whether they are having somatic or body complaints. So these are instruments that allow us to look at the accuracy of symptom report. And again, those are developed by administering them to people with genuine difficulties. And if someone reports over and above what people with genuine difficulties report, or they report things that are different from the kinds of symptoms that someone with a genuine psychological illness, for example, reports, then we can at least understand that we may not be getting an accurate picture of their true problems at that time.
Now, did you have occasion to meet with Philip Chism when you were administering the first of your testing?
I did meet with Mr. Chism, yes.
And without going into anything that was said, do you conduct any sort of an interview or an assessment prior to administering any testing?
Oh, you'll always conduct an interview because you need to get the background data. Test results are of usually no benefit if you don't have a history or a context into which to put those test results.
And in fact, in addition to interviewing Mr. Chism, did you review any records of his prior to conducting your testing?
I did.
What kinds of records did you review?
His school records and a report of a psychiatrist.
And when you met with Mr. Chism, did you have an opportunity to make any observations of his demeanor when you were meeting with him?
Yes, as part of an assessment, you're going to observe how a person behaves during that assessment. Are they cooperative? Is there evidence that they're hearing voices? Are they paying attention to what you're doing? Are they hostile? You're going to be looking for all sorts of things because, again, we need to be able to know, are the results that I'm getting, are they valid?
And when you were making that observation or assessment of Mr. Chism's demeanor, did you have any concerns about going on with your testing?
I did not have any concerns about proceeding with the testing.
Now, doctor, I want to direct you to a particular test, the MMP1A. Was that one of the tests that you conducted on Philip Chism?
Yes, that's actually the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. It's the MMPI, and I used the adolescent version.
May I be heard at sidebar, please?
Sure.
Dr. Hebben, when you say this is the adolescent version, what ages are considered adolescents from your perspective as a psychologist?
Oh, it's not from my perspective, it's from the perspective of the test developers, and this test was developed specifically for adolescent ages. That is, there is an MMPI that you would give to an adult, and this was a version of the MMPI that was extended downward, I believe, to age 14.
And what is the purpose of administering the MMPI?
The MMPI is it's called a personality inventory, but what it really does is allow us to look at the kinds of clinical symptoms someone has, and then to use that objective report and compare the individual to people with documented psychiatric illness to see the profile that someone obtains on the MMPI, which diagnostic group does it appear most similar to. The advantage of the MMPI is that it also contains embedded in it symptom validity measures. So before you even look to the clinical scales to see, is the person reporting a pattern consistent with depression, or are they reporting a pattern consistent with a psychotic disorder, you have to first look to see, is the test valid as a measure of their true psychopathology, if they have it, at that point. And so you look to see, is the person underreporting? That is, are they trying to present themselves as being particularly virtuous? And you can see that from people. So, for example, you could imagine that if someone were in a custody battle for their child and they had to undergo testing, they might want to try to present the very best picture that they could and deny all kinds of psychopathology because they want to have their child in the custody battle. Or if someone is applying for a job, it's not uncommon in some fields like police work and so on that the individuals will have to take the MMPI. And so, again, they want to look particularly good. At the same time, there are scales that allow you to look if someone is exaggerating psychopathology, and that occurs as well. In criminal cases, for example, someone who wants to avoid criminal responsibility might exaggerate their problems in order to look as though they have some severe mental illness. And so you first look at those scales. If those scales reveal that this is a valid profile, then you can go forward and look at the clinical scales to see, okay, what diagnostic group is this person most like?
And how is the MMPI administered? What does the defendant actually have to do?
Well, you can do it paper and pencil so that a person is given the question, a booklet with questions, and then they have a bubble sheet in which they say true or false for each statement. I actually do it with the computer because each statement appears one at a time, and a person just inputs their answer, T for true or F for false for each statement.
And how do you then go about scoring or interpreting the results of the MMPI? How did you in this case?
Well, you simply allow the computer to generate the interpretive report. So this is not my subjective interpretation of this data. This is the data as compared to the diagnostic groups, and it's a report that's generated from the test author.
And Dr. Hebben, what were the results of Philip Chism's MMPI for adolescents?
The results suggested that it was likely invalid because his F-K scale was excessively elevated and suggested that he was attempting to fake bad and to demonstrate that he was severely mentally ill.
He was attempting to demonstrate that he was severely mentally ill. Is that correct?
Correct.
And because he was invalid, you couldn't even go on to interpret the other data as to whether it reflected any mental illness. Is that correct?
Right, because you don't know. When someone is feigning mental illness or exaggerating mental illness, it's as though they are painting the window which you're trying to look through, painting it. And so you can see maybe that there's something moving behind there, but you just don't know what it is. You can't know how much of it is real or if any of it is real.
This might be a time for the break, Your Honor.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take, of course, got to remain in session to address an issue of law. What we're going to have you do is step out. I'm not sure how long it'll take, but we'll move along as efficiently and fairly as we could. Don't discuss the case among yourselves with anybody else. First thing I'll do when you come back into court is to make sure you follow those instructions.
All right.
The doctors.
Okay. All right, Ms. Regan, this is a challenge to which test, please?
If I could just have one moment.
Sure.
It's a challenge to the 3 tests that are not normed for 16-year-olds, and that would be the SIRS, the SIRS, the MFAST, MFAST, and one test by Dr. Kincher, which is the DES2.
All right, you're not going to ask any questions relative to the DES2. for this witness. So, okay. All right. We can proceed with the Dalbert challenge then.
If I could just have,
Well, I think even though it's a Dalbert challenge by the defendant, the proponent of the evidence has the burden under 104A by a preponderance of the evidence. Rules of evidence other than privilege won't apply.
Picking up sort of where we left off, Dr. Haben, given the, let me ask you this, if the results of the MMPIA had not shown, well, let me ask this, the results of the MMPIA showed malingering, is that correct?
Yes.
If the results had not shown malingering, would you necessarily have gone on to look for other testing?
I probably would not have. There was another test that I administered that's also a test for children and adolescents, and that also showed elevations on negativity and what was called fake bad. So the combination of those two led me to know that I needed to administer other measures that had been specifically designed for evaluating malingering in order to obtain what we'd call convergent validity.
And what is convergent validity?
Convergent validity is that getting to the place where all the tests are telling you the same thing. So that you can be sure that you're reducing the risk of a false positive.
And in this case, reducing a risk of a false positive for malingering.
Correct. Trying to be certain, as certain as possible that these tests are really showing malingering.
So would it be fair to say that you only looked at tests that were not normed for 16-year-olds in an effort to give the defendant the benefit of the doubt?
Well, I have to sort of correct that a bit, because the Sears, in fact, has been extended down to a population of as young as 14. So the developer of the Sears, Richard Rogers, has in fact used it with a population of individuals 14 to 17 years old. And he himself gives advice on using the test. The MFAST.
Before you go to the MFAST, did you have that advice from Dr. Rogers before utilizing the Sears test?
Yes, it's in there. He has written a very important text on assessment of deception in criminal matters, or really in all matters. And there's a chapter in there specifically devoted to evaluating deception in children and adolescents. And I had consulted with that before testing Mr. Chism.
Thank you.
And with respect to the MFAST, why did you elect to use the MFAST on Mr. Chism, and for what ages is it normed down to?
It has been normed down to age 17. And I elected to use that because there's no reasonable expectation that a 16-and-a-half-year-old would differ significantly in terms of the expression of psychopathology or psychosis. The symptoms are the same as they would be in a 17-year-old and in an adult. And so knowing that I had two measures that had been specifically designed initially for adolescents, a third measure that had been extended downward to age 14, I felt comfortable adding a measure that I knew had also been validated into down to 17.
And what is the purpose? Do the Sears and the MFAST test the same thing or the same area?
They do. They are specifically symptom validity tests. They're not about measuring psychopathology. They are tests that are designed to look at whether or not someone is reporting rare symptoms, whether their reported symptoms line up with observed symptoms, whether they're reporting plausible symptoms, whether they're reporting rare symptom combinations. So they are designed to have put together things that are inconsistent with psychopathology to see to the level to which someone endorses those inconsistencies.
And with the 4 tests you did, were you able to achieve convergent validity?
Oh, yes.
And had one of the tests, particularly the MFAS, but any of them sort of skewed completely differently, would you have taken that into account in your conclusion?
Absolutely.
But in fact, they did not. Is that fair to say?
They did not. They all showed evidence of faking bad, of evidence that indicated malingering.
I have nothing further for this hearing. Your
The Sears and the MFAS have manuals, correct?
They do.
And the manual is important because it tells you how to give the test, correct?
It's important because it tells you how to give the test. It also gives you, tells you about how the test was developed and the interpretation of the test as well.
And it tells you how to score the test.
Yes, I'm sorry, did I not include that?
No, it's a
Oh,
question.
yes, oh, okay.
Now, you consider it important to always be familiar with the manual, correct?
It is important to be familiar with test manuals.
And the Sears manual states that the Sears is appropriate, is intended for use with adult populations 18 or over, correct?
That's correct.
And what that means is that the group that it was normed against was an adult group, correct?
When it was originally developed, that's correct.
And the adult group isn't just 18-year-olds, it's a whole adult group, correct?
Correct.
Now, you wrote that there was, that there is supportive data, well, you testified supportive data using the Sears down to age 14, correct?
Correct.
And that is when limited to non-psychotic clinical samples, correct?
Presuming you understand or know that someone is psychotic at the time that you're administering the test, you probably should not give the Sears, whether they're an adolescent or an adult.
Okay, you wrote you wrote this statement in your report. Rogers et al., 1976, have used the Sears with an adolescent population and confirmed that it can provide supportive data on feigning when limited to non-psychotic clinical samples, correct?
That is what Rogers has said, yes.
And so, Mr. Chism, so the test results are valid when it is, you are dealing with, excuse me, when extending it down and using that norm, you are making the assumption that Mr. Chism is non-psychotic, correct?
No. Whenever you go in to do testing, you go in with a series of hypotheses. And if in testing Mr. Chism, I had concluded that there was evidence of psychosis, then I would have taken that into consideration in the use of these tests.
But Rogers says it's only valid in a non-psychotic population, correct?
Well, actually, Rogers also says that after examining participant responses in a within-subjects honest feigning design, Rogers and colleagues recommend that the Sears be used in collaboration with other measures rather than as the sole instrument. And that's exactly what I did. I used it in collaboration with other measures, specifically designed for adolescents.
And that's particularly true of the Sears, that it has to be used in conjunction with other tests because it is not normed for adolescents, correct?
No. The reason that you use tests in collaboration with other tests is because one test in and of itself could provide what would be considered a false positive. That means you could be misdiagnosing someone or misdescribing them if you put all your eggs in one basket. So by using multiple instruments, we use multiple instruments in every case, whether it's recommended by Dr. Rogers or not. And the reason we use multiple instruments is because, as I said before, we're looking for convergent validity. We don't want to bring in an incorrect statement.
But before you get into other areas, in the area of neuropsychology, has Dr. Rogers' text as far as use and evaluation of adolescents as it relates to Sears been subject to peer review?
It was published in, I think Ms. Reagan just said 1976, and if that's what it says in my report...
96.
96, yeah, right. I heard her say 1976, but I know that it was published in Roger, Hines, and Sewell's in 1996, and that was a peer-reviewed paper, correct.
Okay, and has that subsequently been peer-reviewed by other neuropsychologists?
I don't have the answer to that question. I just know that these are tests that are standard in these sorts of investigations.
When you say standard, you mean standard in the neuropsychology community?
Correct.
Okay. And generally accepted?
Generally accepted.
Okay.
Now, it's fair to say that the manual states that the Sears has not been validated on children or young adults under the age of 18, correct?
That's fair to say. That's correct. When the test was originally developed, it was developed based on a population of 18 and above.
Now, is it your testimony that the manual is never updated?
Typically, manuals are not updated unless they completely renorm the test. It's very expensive to develop tests and to publish them.
So in this case, if you were going by the manual, the Sears would not have been appropriate for an adolescent, correct?
If I hadn't done the additional research to discover that, in fact, the Sears is commonly used in adolescent populations, that is correct, if I went strictly by the manual.
Now, directing your attention to the MFAST. The MFAST has a manual, correct?
That is correct.
And the MFAST says that it is intended for use for adults 18 and over, correct?
That's correct.
That means that it has been normed against an adult population.
It has been normed against individuals 18 and above, correct.
And so that would be diverse by age.
Diverse by age.
The group that it was normed against, the group that it was used for to create the norms, was diverse by age.
She just means not just 18-year-olds.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I didn't understand what you were asking. Correct. It wasn't normed only on 18-year-olds.
Now, you in fact had a footnote in your report, let's see, about the MFAST. Page, let's see. You had a footnote in your report concerning the MFAS, correct?
I believe that's correct. I'm
And it was,
looking now to see if I can find it.
You know what page the footnotes are on, Ms. Regan?
you know, I can't pull it up. I know it's there. Oh, maybe not a footnote. I'm sorry, I think it's a sentence. And you testified to it. The research extends it down to age 17 and a half, did you say?
No, I said that Mr. Chism was 16 and a half. The research extends it down to 17.
Relative to MFAS.
Correct.
And MFAST, the MFAST, the norm that it is, the group that the norm is created from is age 17 to well into adulthood, correct?
No, I believe that that was specifically a younger population, but let me just double check to be sure. Oh, it was 17 to 66 years old.
So by using those norms, you wouldn't be comparing 16-year-old Philip Chisholm to 17-year-old people, correct?
We should be careful here in our use of norms, okay? Because, for example, an IQ test has to be specifically given to the age, and you need to use the specific norms developed for a particular age, because IQ changes over time in the sense that as we get older, our skills diminish, and unless we compare our people to people their own age, it would appear as though our IQ were declining, when in fact it really doesn't. So when we assess IQ, we compare people to people their own age to look to see are skills average or not. In the development of things like the SEERS and the MFAS, what's being looked at there are the typical signs of psychopathology, and those are universal. Because when you go to the DSM-5, it doesn't say, well, in a severe major depressive disorder, for example, it doesn't say that we have particular symptoms that we see in 16-and-a-half-year-olds, and we see totally different symptoms in 17-year-olds. So what you're being compared to on the Miller forensic assessment for symptoms and the structured inventory of reported symptoms, you're being compared to whether or not you are reporting symptoms that are consistent with psychopathology versus symptoms that are inconsistent with psychopathology. And so that's the norm there.
There's a science to this, though.
Yes, this is psychometrics, exactly.
Right. So what happens is, for the Miller, for the MFAST, there is a group of age 17 to whatever, well into adulthood, and from that group, you find what the details of details of reported psychiatric symptoms that are consistent with people that have severe psychiatric illnesses, right?
No, you do not. This is, in fact, looking at the symptoms that are inconsistent with severe psychiatric illness.
So what this group is a group of people that are reporting symptoms but aren't mentally ill? What is the control group? What is the group that the norm is developed by in the MFAS?
What you're looking at with these particular measures is a person's endorsement of symptoms that are inconsistent with psychopathology.
And so the question that's not answered is, are the symptoms endorsed by a 16-year-old inconsistent with mental illness, correct?
The question that's being asked is, could we reasonably expect that a 16-and-a-half-year-old would be so different from a 17-year-old in terms of the report or the endorsement of symptoms inconsistent with psychopathology that we would have to deem the measure invalid for use in a 16-and-a-half-year-old?
And that's an assumption you're making.
It's not an assumption, it's a testing of a hypothesis that I'm making with using that test. And my hypothesis is I will see on the MFAST findings similar to those that I saw on the MMPI-A, that I saw on the BASC, and that I saw on the Sears, in order to know whether or not I am measuring the same thing.
Now, you have, you admit that there are tests that are appropriate for adolescents.
There are no, of all the performance validity tests that we use, all of the symptom validity tests that we use, the independent standalone performance validity tests and symptom validity tests have all been developed on adults and then extended downward to children in some cases, and to adolescents and children and adolescents in other cases.
And they've been extended down by studies that have been conducted, correct?
Yes.
And these studies are published in peer-reviewed journals, correct?
Correct.
And when the tests have been extended down and there's sufficient studies to support it, then the test can be used with younger people, correct?
You can use a test with anyone, whether or not there's been any peer-reviewed studies of it.
It would be good science to wait until there was data that validated it for the group, correct?
I'm not sure it would be good science. I think what is important is that one take into consideration what data are available for a particular test and then make a reasoned decision as to whether or not it should be included in a test battery.
Okay, I have no further questions.
Okay. Ms. Regan, your challenge is, just that I can make sure here, before the doctor steps down for a minute, is as it relates not to the Sears and MFAST in general, but as it relates to Sears and MFAST for somebody that hasn't reached a certain age, an adolescent. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. All right, you can step down. Thank you.
May I need this here?
Sure.
Oh, I have just one question. Did you bring your raw data with you?
Yes, I did.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Ms. Regan, I'll hear you on your argument.
We heard from Dr. Casey just how important it is to use tests that are normed for the group that the patient belongs in, the patient is a member of. And these are adult tests. They are not normed for, the manuals do not recommend that they not be used, says they're not appropriate for people Mr. Chism's age. And in fact, the Sears, as applied to juveniles by the research that the experts cited, is for non-psychotic populations, and that's assuming a fact that's at issue here, and I'd suggest that the use of the test in these circumstances doesn't meet Daubert. As regards the MFAST, the fact of the matter is he wasn't 17, and the test, again, the manual does not recommend that it be used for people under 18. In fact, it says it's not appropriate for people under 18. And this expert in the Commonwealth should not be able to put in evidence of tests that were not appropriate for Mr. Chism.
Thank you. Ms. McDougall?
You know, it's not a breathalyzer, and the manual is not the be-all and end-all, nor is it that rigid as Dr. Hebben explained. In fact, the Sears has been expanded down as far as 14 by the developer of the instrument, is what she said. That Dr. Richard Rogers, who developed the instrument, has extended it down as far as 14. With respect to the MFAST, certainly she can be cross-examined on its validity with respect to a 16-and-a-half-year-old versus a 17-year-old. But again, the manual is not the be-all and end-all. And I would note that with respect to both of these tests, I would also note that I certainly intend to elicit before the MFAST that if she had had any concerns that Mr. Chism was experiencing psychosis, she would not have administered that particular test, or she at least would have accounted for that in her testing. These additional tests were done, as she explained, to try and achieve convergent validity because of the way he scored on the tests that are undoubtedly intended for adolescents. If anything, I would respectfully suggest they were done to give him the benefit of the doubt.
All right. Thank you. All right. So I find by a preponderance of the evidence, not limited by the rules of evidence other than privilege, that gatekeeper reliability has been satisfied under both Fry and independently under Daubert-Lanigan, under both ways to achieve gatekeeper reliability. I note that I don't believe at the end of direct the request for a Daubert hearing before cross-examination is administered in any way preserves the record for such a challenge, but nonetheless the court makes the finding both independently under Fry, general acceptance, and under Daubert-Lanigan by a preponderance of the evidence that gatekeeper reliability has been satisfied. More specifically, the use of other tests, specifically MFAST and Sears, on a 16-year-old if the MMPI raises issues of feigning, is generally accepted in the neuropsychological community in an effort to achieve convergent validity. The issue before the court is not whether or not MFAST in and of itself satisfies general acceptance for those under the age of 17. Court notes parenthetically that the defendant was approximately 16 and a half, end quote, but that, end paren, excuse me, but that MFAST has general acceptance when used to achieve convergent validity after the MMPI has raised issues concerning feigning. Before getting more specific, I'll just say that the Sears test that Dr. Richard Rogers text, which is a peer-reviewed text and has been utilized for almost 20 years for the purposes used here, is used for 14 to 17-year-olds to provide assessments relative to detection. In fact, there's a chapter specifically as it relates to adolescents. As it relates to the MFAST, again, that's been validated through general acceptance in the scientific community and through a test that in general hasn't been challenged down to 17 years old. Again, the MFAST, as I stated a moment ago, is not being looked at in a vacuum, but to achieve convergent validity. What's being tested here is whether the symptoms are inconsistent with the psychopathology. That's the purpose of the testing here. On a broader note, as it relates to Dalbert Lanigan as opposed to general acceptance, both independent ways to achieve and satisfy gatekeeper reliability, where the underlying MFAST and Sears test is not being challenged as to under Dalbert Lanigan, nor does it seem that it in good faith could be based on what I heard, that therefore testing, error rate, peer review publication standards, and general acceptance in the scientific community being satisfied down to 17-year-olds as it relates to Sears, as it relates to Sears, and 14 to 17-year-olds as it relates, 17 years as it relates to MFAST, and 14 to 17 years old as it relates to Sears, that there's, by preponderance of the evidence, a satisfaction of Dalbert Lanigan as it relates to the use, in this case, with somebody 16 years old, not in a vacuum, but in the context of achieving convergent validity for symptoms inconsistent with psychopathology. For those reasons, the court finds that gatekeeper reliability under 104A has been satisfied by a preponderance of the evidence. All right, why don't we take the morning recess? The defendant's objection is noted. And are there any issues before we recess that'll save the jury time at the sidebar?
My cross will cover raw data.
All right, so Ms. McDougall, you let Ms. Draper know at 10:55 whether you're requesting more time. And let me just see counsel at the sidebar for one moment.